I would like to introduce Anna Hurst. She is the owner of Eco Blossom Garden Center Nursery and also of the Happy Garden Design. She has been in our area since 2006. She has been designing gardens for other gardeners since 2008. Her store has been open since 2018. Her nursery, which is only open by appointment, it's an online shop. And she is one of our premier nice nurseries, which, as you know, means that has more than 80% native plants. And we recently changed the designation so that we separated it. So all of our membership has the opportunity to know where they can find the greatest percentage of native plants. Anna has been the provider for me of many plants going into my native ground. She has been a countless advisor and given me lots of opportunities to try things that I wouldn't have tried without her advice. I've been very happy with most of them. Occasionally we have a plant that doesn't like where I put it, and as you all know, that means it moves somewhere else. So before I continue on and drive you all crazy, I'll just tell you that Anna's going to be a delightful speaker, and I actually think that we have such a large turnout tonight because people have anticipated her coming. Anna?
Hi, everyone. Let me know if you cannot hear me or understand me. I tend to talk pretty fast. And I also welcome questions during the presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't mess with me in any way. So today I wanted to talk, and some of the information I'm going to talking about, you probably know, but I wanted to start with the fluid nature of native gardens. When the traditional landscaping, there's a lot of predictability that comes with it. You have a plant that's supposed to be a certain size, it's supposed to bloom at a certain time. With that comes a lot of kind of static type gardens where nothing really changes or doesn't change a lot. If you have a non-native perennial garden, you still have some changes because you have blooms and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it's a very predictable type of landscaping. With native plants, if you're going to go into it with a mindset of that's going to be the same as non-native, but with natives, you are going to be frustrated. To me, that is the strength of native plants. Because with non-native plants, if you put something and it doesn't do well, or the weather messes with it, whatever, you end up with a hole. With native plants, something will move in that spot. You might not necessarily like what moves in. You might have to move it around sometimes, but you're not going to have empty spaces. But what I wanted to talk about is one, using annuals in native gardens. I feel like from when customers come to me, there's a lot of hesitance when it comes to annuals, and a lot of these kind of misconceptions that if you have an annual, you plant it, it blooms, and then it's done, and you don't have it anymore. If that was the case, we wouldn't have blue bonnets. So the native plants, as long as you let them go to seed, they're going to have them perpetuated. I have one of my favorites is American basket flower, which is an annual. I planted it once 10 years ago. I have them every single year, and it's very showy and bumblebees love it. But don't be afraid, because don't be afraid that the annuals, they are going to move, because the nature of it, when they seed out, you don't really have a control. They might seed exactly where the mother plant was, but the wind might put the seeds, 10 feet over, and there's only so much you can control. However, when things sprout, if you have too much of something, or if something sprouted in a spot where you specifically do not want it, super easy to pull. It's not really an issue. And they're great fillers, and usually in the spring, you have really exceptional display of flowers. Like this past spring, because it was so wet, everything was just really blossoming. But also, when you plan your garden, think before you put anything in the garden or before you add anything to your garden, think of what you're trying to achieve. Everyone has their own style and their own tolerances of, how neat it has to be or how natural. Think of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then by maintenance, edit it. If, sometimes something becomes very prolific and then you end up basically monoculture of something, you don't necessarily want that either. So it is up to you to just periodically kind of check your garden and see if anything needs work, right? Even with perennials and with grasses, you have that fluidity as well. The great thing and the strength of it is that if you plant densely and if you plant native plants, even if something doesn't do well, even if something gets killed, we have cats at the shop, so there are, victims sometimes. Even if that happens, it's very easy to replace. And by replace, I don't mean go and buy another plant, just wait till something moves in and see if you like it. Another thing that makes really a difference with native plants is how every year, or sometimes every season, your garden will be completely different. The expectations that each species will perform the exact same way each year is not a realistic expectation with native plants. And so, 1 year something will really shine and you'll be like in awe how wonderful it looks. But next year, maybe the weather patterns will be such that something else will be shining. And that plant from the previous year will be looking okay, but it will not be that spectacular display that it was the year before. And so that's something that I learned to appreciate. It's something like your garden always has a surprise for you, and you just have to wait and see what the surprise is. I wanted very quickly to show you a little progress of a pollinator garden that we have at the shop. It's just a 20 by 30 bed, nothing big. There was nothing there before we planted. I mean, there was there, but it was Bermuda and a bunch of other things that I didn't want. And it was planted last July. And you remember the summer of last year. It was not fun. But we didn't really lose anything. So I wanted to quickly show you how things changed. So this was July 2023 when I planted everything. And I always tell my clients, my landscape clients, when we plant perennial gardens, the day of planting is not going to be big wow, it's going to be kind of anticlimactic. Because if you space your perennials correctly, that's what this looks like. However, April 2024, This is this year, obviously, the spring. We get a lot of rains. We have heavy soil at the shop. So my worry actually was that it's going to get too wet, which actually it ended up being a little bit. Well, that's not what I wanted, sorry. So May 1st. So that's where the display started. And this is just the beginning. Because it was so wet, my annuals ended up being really twice the size that I expected them in terms of height. So in the spring, the annuals really took over, and that was my main display. So this is kind of at its peak. And because the weather was mild and it was rainy, the display lasted almost till July. Well, I keep clicking the wrong thing. You know what? Here we go. So this is June. Let me see. So this was the peak. This is June of 2024. You can see a lot less yellow. I've started to pull out the annuals that went to seed, and by then we're kind of all browned out. You still see all the purples that's still, and some of the yellows that's still the annuals. I did the changes gradually, but you can see a lot more open spaces. This is July 2024. Very few annuals left, but that opened up all the space for the perennials to start shining. By September, while we still had some blooms, the grasses really started to kind of hold their own. And to me, the grasses was what makes the garden. Perennial gardens without grasses miss a dimension. Then the weather cooled down a little bit. We got a little bit of rain. That was our whole October. It was just basically blues, purples, and yellows everywhere. So what I wanted to show with this is, if you remember the photo from the spring, from May, where it was this big display of purple and yellow, and what this is right now. Right now it's more muted because there's not that much blooming anymore. Now the grasses are really shining. The grass is adding a lot of texture. And another thing the grasses are doing is providing winter interest, which with perennial gardens, interest in the winter is kind of hard to get. So choosing the right plants for the right spot. So I am often told that I might have to have some magic fingers and everything just grows and I know what I'm doing. Well, there is no magic finger and there's no secret. I just pay attention to my garden. I like being in my garden, even if it's just for a few minutes every single day. So I know where is the wet spot, where's the dry spot, what's happening with everything. I notice if something is not doing well, I notice it in the very beginning, not when the plant is dead. So it is all about matching the plant to the environment. There's a native plant for pretty much any conditions you can think of. We always kind of stress drought tolerance, but there are plenty of spaces where you need something that can handle extra rain. Maybe you have a wet spot. Maybe you have a garden at the bottom of a slope where the water gathers. Not every garden wants a drought tolerant plant. So to me, the success of trying to find and match a plant with this with the spot in the garden that you have is number one, soil. I think everyone focuses on sun shade conditions and almost no one questions the soil. And I can tell you that when customers come and I ask them, what kind of soil do you have? The number one answer I get is, that's what usually that is 100% the word people always use. Oh, my soil is very crappy. And then I ask, what do you mean it's crappy? Well, it's rocky. Well, what do you mean it's good drainage? What do you mean crappy? It's crappy, it's great. Just find the spot for it. Or a heavy clay. Heavy clay, nothing will grow. Well, my whole pollinator garden is in very heavy clay. Things can grow just fine if you put the right plant to the right spot. Sun exposure, that is the one that people usually focus the most. The one thing that I will say about that is that oftentimes I find that customers misremember. So what happens a lot is we remember one moment in time. Oh, I remember that afternoon in the summer, I was standing there and it was so sunny. Well, what the customer doesn't remember is that it was sunny for 2 hours. It's still shade. So kind of remembering what I always say, if you're trying to judge how sunny or not your garden is, think of the height of the summer, July, August, when the hottest time, because that's the sun that's going to make the hottest sun that's going to make most of a difference for your plants. And try to figure out how many hours of direct sun that spot hits. And if there is shade, is it a shade that comes from a man-made structure like a house or a fence? Or is it tree shade? That makes a difference too. Northern exposure with like a 2-story house, that's like super tough because you'll hardly ever get any sun. But deciduous tree, there's still plenty of sun to be around usually, unless you have completely overlapping canopies. Watering needs. Are you going to be hand watering? Do you have sprinklers? Is there any drainage issue? Figure those things out. I mean, you can figure them out by just planting things and seeing, well, do they do well or not? But that can become frustrating after a while. The more you plant and the more you pay attention to your garden, the more successful you will become. And those trials will become more success than failure. And so it will give you confidence that you know, it's not so much that you know what you're doing because every garden is different, but that you know what you're doing in your own space. And every site, even just like a typical urban garden, has microclimates, has spots that dry out quicker. There are shadier, there are moisture, there may be drainage problems. Your soil will also not always be the native soil throughout the garden. If you are in a house that was built recently, your foundation beds are most likely not native soil. It's probably clay that was brought in by the builder. So don't assume just because you have soil of a certain type in one spot that that's your whole property. You have probably heard, if you follow dactylomy, you probably heard keystone species and why they're important. Those are the plants that they support the most species. They're all native plants are great, but there are some species that support so much more life, whether it's being a host plant or a food source, than other plants. And so if those keystone species are removed, they really drastically change the ecosystem in that space. A lot of keystone species are actually so-called aggressive species. And I find a lot of fear mongering when it comes to aggressive species in various Facebook groups. And first of all, I find it to be a double standard. So one of the things that people always warn about is if something tends to sucker, and I say, I don't understand why everyone is fine with primrose suckering left and right, but you give them a roughly dogwood and everyone is, oh gosh, they sucker. And same, by the way, with any type of toxicity in a plant. There's a lot of fear mongering. There's a lot of misinformation. Just because something is toxic, it doesn't mean it's lethal. There's different levels of toxicity. And and I'm like, so you're afraid of Mexican buckeye, but you're okay to have a sago palm in New York? Like, how is that right? So there's a double standard. We let the non-native plants get away with a lot more, and we're very suspicious regarding native plants. So with the aggressive species, I say, learn what is the nature of them being aggressive. Do they reseed aggressively? Do they spread by runners? What kind of conditions are ideal to them? Aggressive species tend to be aggressive in really favorable conditions. For instance, one of my favorite shade grasses, inland sea oats, has this reputation of just going crazy and being unmanageable. I hear that all the time. It drives me crazy. I have planted inland sea oats at the shop in a very, very dry location on a berm that is almost impossible to water because of how it's shaped. And I had that plant for 4 years now, and it hasn't moved one bit because it's not favorable condition. It's looking great, but it's just not doing anything because there's not enough moisture for it to go out. Same with goldenrods. Goldenrods are extremely valuable species, keystone species. And all I ever hear is, oh, goldenrods, now they're too aggressive. Tall goldenrod, for instance, is aggressive. But know how it is. It spreads by runners. If you go in the spring after good rain, you can chop out a lot of those runners and manage it. Is it going to want to be aggressive under ideal conditions? Yes. Should we not plant it? I say go for it. Just learn how to manage it. Late boneset is another great example. Extremely aggressive reseeder. If you let it, you'll have thousands of it. There's a very simple way to control it, which is you let it, the pollinators have the use of it. Once it goes to seed, cut it. So you have all the benefit and there's nothing negative to say. I've been controlling late boneset this way for a long time, never an issue. So instead of being afraid of aggressive spreaders, just learn, do you have a spot somewhere that is less that, you don't want it, if you want to control it, you want to put it where it's slightly uncomfortable. Not to the point that doesn't want to grow at all, but to a point where it's under stress a little bit. And then it will be much less aggressive. When you are designing your gardens, I think like the typical traditional landscaping is just islands or just beds by the fence, that sort of thing. Very kind of linear, or even if they're not linear, they're kind of separated. If you are planting natives, to me, one of the biggest motivators of planting native plants is because you're creating an ecosystem. And so if you want that to work as an ecosystem, try to create wildlife corridors. So beds that are connected. So you don't have like an island and a bunch of grass and an island. And then those critters, it's almost like they have to, swim through the seas to reach the other bed, So it looks very nice aesthetically if you do it right, but it also serves a purpose that's practical for the benefit of the pollinators and other wildlife. Plant for diversity. I feel that's a challenge oftentimes, because when you think of landscape design, or traditionally what landscape design was, with these kind of little groupings of plants and then spaces and mulch and everything being clean, that's not really congruent and compatible with both gardening for wildlife and native plants. It's also, in my opinion, not good landscape design. That landscape design assumes that you will have to really work hard to maintain it. Sorry. When you plant for diversity for all seasons, and when you plant densely, you are creating a garden that really is working for you. Yes, you can maintain it when you want to edit it. From time to time, you'll have to weed. From time to time, you'll have to trim something off. In the shop, we have the pollinator garden that I showed you, and then the multiple other gardens. Probably spent an hour this year weeding, because everything is planted very densely. But also because it's planted very densely, I was able to use a lot of various species and bring a lot of diversity to a small space. And then, of course, when you're planting for wildlife, you want to have the blooms and you can enjoy, and you want to, that's the food for the pollinators, for the adults. But it is not a complete ecosystem if you don't have host plants, something that supports the offspring and enables them to complete the cycle. When you are designing, and that's kind of, native or non-native, choose a focal point. If you are just moving into a house and you kind of have a blank slate, start with big items, your trees and big shrubs. And first of all, they will take longer to achieve mature size, so you want them in the ground as quickly as you can get them. But also those will be the anchors in your garden. And then the small stuff you can kind of feel around and have fun with it. But you want those big stuffs to start growing. When you're putting in a shrub that's meant to be, say, 15 feet, but you're buying it as a $5 inch like this, it can be very deceiving. If you don't have a whole lot of experience designing, it's easy to misjudge what the thing will be. So I find that it's very useful to literally take a piece of tape or water hose or spray paint or whatever and mark it out. And you will be surprised visually how much space that is that you haven't predicted. Probably one of the biggest mistakes and most common mistakes that I see when clients are, they're either doing themselves or someone is doing it for them that doesn't know what they're doing, is thinking of what is right now versus thinking of what it will be in 5 or 10 years. And what happens then is we come in 3 years later and basically have to pull out half the stuff because, the thought is, oh, we want the garden looking full when we're collecting the check, right? And then, what happens in 3 years? We don't care. It just makes no sense. Even if you are using native plants, I suggest not creating monocultures, because what happens is when you have a monoculture, like a big swath of one species of plant, any kind of failure is extremely visible, and you can see it with grasses in particular. You trim it, it doesn't come back fully, it starts looking really poorly, and then you have a big swath with like 3 grasses looking great, and then the rest looks like you don't want to look at it. So, when you look at the landscaping that did around Chisholm Trail, apart from using Vitex and a bunch of other things, is that's what they did. Big swath on one species and big swath on one species. It looks really great the first year. The second year, it started looking less great. By now, it's looking crappy. There are whole big swaths that are looking like there's like few sprigs here and there, and that's it. So any mistakes, any disease, any pest, and you basically have to replace the whole thing. Now, if you're going for a modern design, that's kind of almost unavoidable. But even then, I say try to find ways to create lead lines with multiple species versus just like monoculture of 2 or 3 species. I often get the question of how do you, by nature, softscaping with native plants oftentimes ends up looking very natural, which I really like, but I also understand maybe sometimes we need to add structure to the garden. So what I really like to do is using stonework, using boulders, using flagstone, using garden water feature, anything, artwork, whatever you can add to create spaces in the garden. And then fill those spaces with native. And then you have a juxtaposition of that soft and the hard is defining the space. And all of a sudden, it doesn't look like it just happened and it looks intentional. It doesn't look like it just happened by accident and you just planted a bunch of things and that's what it is. For winter interest, I know the number one focus is, I want everything evergreen. First of all, if you focus only on evergreen, you'll be really limited in your choices. Second of all, evergreen gardens are boring. They're static, nothing ever changes. I mean, it's like having fake plants. Who wants that? And so what I say is, feel free to use a few kind of strategically placed evergreen species, so you have something in the winter. Add grasses, they add great texture even when they're dormant. And deciduous shrub can really, because even though they lose the leaves, they still provide structure. And so let's see if I can show you. This is what I was going to show. This is my button bush in my garden. And it was one winter when we had freezing rain. And I mean, to me, it was like the most beautiful thing. And it was middle of winter. It was completely bare, but it looked beautiful. When designing, so the opposite of creating monocultures, these big swaths of same species, would be like a nature design. And so what it is you choose a variety of species, you make a design out of it, and then you repeat it. So what happens with that is your garden looks natural, but it looks intentional because you have repetition throughout the garden. So in our pollinator garden, for instance, that I interspaced Indian grass. And because it's tall, you can really see it and it kind of punctuates the garden. It makes it look a lot more intentional. And then I always like to, in all of that, throw in a few kind of one-offs, something that will be a surprise. If you're designing on a hillside and you have erosion problem, which I do in my own garden, so your choice of plants have to have another kind of, you have to look for plants that are really good at erosion control, native grasses. You want big fibrous roots. You don't, if you have one deep taproot, that's fantastic for the drought tolerance of the plant. That doesn't really do much for retaining soil. So you want to focus on plants. Coralberry is another one of plants that will basically create just this mass of roots that will hold the soil in place. If your challenge is really deep shade, especially when you have a live oak and it's overlapping canopies and can be really, really dark and plants are struggling, in really deep shade, I always plan that whatever the mature size of a plant is supposed to be, I cut it by half. I know it will never achieve it. Typically Terrascap gets to about here. In my shade deep garden, it gets about here. So you just have to plant things closer. If you want to have that full look, just assume the plants are not going to achieve the full size that they might under optimal conditions. Understanding drought tolerant plant. I think oftentimes the challenge is that we bring plants from the nursery and we know those plants are really drought tolerant. So we kind of stick them in the ground, we water them and say, see you next year. And I think that comes from the mistake of not understanding what kind of treatment they receive at the grower and the nursery level. They're in pots. especially if they're in 4-inch pots, they are watered in the summer every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. You have to, because they're sitting, there's nothing to insulate it, nothing to cool it, there's nothing to retain that moisture. So you cannot take that plant, stick it in the ground, say, oh, you are drought tolerant, so, I'll just leave you alone. You have to gradually wean it off. And well, we'll talk about the irrigation later, because that's kind of my pet peeve. But also, when you are putting something that is very, very xeric, that's meant to, those plants typically want also excellent drainage and not heavy material, not heavy organic matter. So like, you don't want to put something like the Damanita that's glowing yellow here in heavy clay, which of course you can say, but you have heavy clay, so how come you have all this? Well, I had to dig it up like a foot down and replace it with something that's very well draining. And we additionally at the shop have the benefit of the whole property being on a slope. So instead of water gathering, it goes beyond that point to the lowest point. So, people often ask me, what's the key to success with agaves? Because this is the kind of the iconic drought tolerant plant that people like. And it's not the freezes. There's plenty of pretty hardy agaves out there. The key is drainage in the winter. You have to put it somewhere where even if we have rain, the drainage will be so sharp that it will not be, just very low organic matter, honestly. And really sharp drainage. Once again, know your soil. It's not impossible. So like I really wanted, this is a picture of our, what I call rock garden, which I really wanted to have a space for those smaller species, which oftentimes the xeric species are kind of smaller in posture, just to kind of showcase them. But also I knew I had really, really heavy clay. So how do I do that? And that's why I had to dig up about a foot down and add a lot of rock, add a lot of inorganic matter, and hope that with that slope, it was enough. So far, so good, but it's only been a year. So I'm still kind of looking how that's going to turn out. And watering. Number one question I get is, so I get this plant, how do I water? And everyone is expecting me to give them some sort of simple once a week, once a month, whatever. There is no such a thing, because how do you water something when it's 60 degrees out there? And how do you water when it's 105? I mean, it's just going to be different things. So for the establishment, I say you put something in the ground, you soak it really good, and then you get it to a point where it's almost stressed. When the root ball is not bone dry, but it's dry enough, like, you want 4-6 inches down dry, and then you soak it again. Those periods between, this is my nemesis. Those periods between watering will become longer and longer. But you also have to understand that it takes a plant about 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the season, for those roots that they were initially in a pot to really expand in the soil next to it, to be able to pull that moisture. Because sometimes when we plant new landscape, people will say, oh, this is really wet soil right here. I'm like, well, doesn't matter, because your plant is right here and the roots are right here, and there's no way you can pull it. So what I say is, check it. Stick your finger in the root ball. If you can't, you can buy $10 water moisture meter. It's not perfect, but you'll be able to put it easily in really even dry conditions, or somewhere whether it's really a lot of roots or you have a rocky soil. And you want to get it to that dry point before you water again. I would probably have a really nice nest egg if I took money for every time someone tells me that they are watering every day, because it's summer or they just planted it. I don't know why people have this idea that more water is better, but more water also kills very, very quickly. So this is just consideration for gardens in the winter. Grasses, deciduous shrubs, evergreen shrubs, just a really nice combination of heights and textures. Evergreen it doesn't have, you're looking at accents. You're not looking at like your whole garden being evergreen. grasses. I talk a lot about grasses because I find grasses are the most overlooked. Everyone is focusing on the blooms, and the bigger the better, which is kind of the opposite with me. I love the little tiny things where I can find them. Oh my gosh, it's so intricate. But if you love blooms, plenty of blooms to be had. But grasses add another dimension to the garden. It's not only that they add texture and movement. In the winter, they add really nice colors. Right now, I'm looking at bushy bluestem, and it looks like cinnamon brown. It's just really gorgeous. They also create spaces for wildlife to overwinter and provide food for birds, but also so many of our native grasses are house plants, which I feel like it's overlooked. When customers come to our shop, everyone just always wants to look at the pollinator garden, and they're astounded for what it is for just being 1 year in the ground. But once again, it's always the blooms, right? And I'm like, if you want to have really healthy habitat, you really need to incorporate your grasses. And also, so you saw the garden, it was full of color in the spring, and then it was color again in the fall. But that summer period, once again, grasses is what really carried it. Well, there were some blooms, don't get me wrong. Indian grass started popping up, First, it was this really nice white blade with kind of bluish tint to it. Then you have the seed heads. There's a lot that native grasses can bring to the table. And I feel like a garden without them kind of loses a dimension. That should go without saying, but consider mature size of plants. And I say it, even though it should go without saying, because it happens every single day. It's so easy. So this is my button bush. That's probably 13 by 13. And when you buy 1 gallon, that's like one little sprig. It's so easy to miscalculate of what it's going to be. That's why you have all these gray models planted a foot away from foundation. So. Button bush.
Button bush, thank you.
You're welcome. Full sun, by the way. I know wildflower.org says shade. They are a fantastic resource. They do make mistakes like we all do. It's not a shade plant. Planting correctly. By the way, am I running out of time? Does anyone know? I tend to rumble. Planting correctly, root disturbance and transplant shock. So what happens, 2 things can happen. One is, and actually happened to customers of ours recently, she bought Ezexmania that was very, very well rooted, kind of not there yet, but on the cusp of being root bound in a pot with really big top. So what happened was it looked great. She put it in the ground. She watered it. It looked great until 2 days later. It didn't look great anymore because it was getting watered twice a day. It was summer, twice a day in our nursery. And with all this roots and with all the top where that's of course moisture evaporation, it was just not enough. It went all brown and she kind of, called me panicking. And I said, it's okay. As long as it's not dead, you can just cut the tops off, leave just a few leaves at the bottom, soak it good. You want it to root first. When you're planting plants, don't worry about blooming. Even if that means that you're losing the blooms for the season, that's not the whole point. The whole point of the first year is to get root establishment. That is your whole point. If something is really full and lush at the top, I tend to just routinely cut it by half at least before I put it in the ground. Because I want the plant, when they're blooming, a lot of energy goes to that. You want that energy to be into root establishment. Another thing that happens, especially with species that typically don't have very robust root system, is that you pull it out of the pot and the soil just goes sideways and you end up with a bunch of roots and the plant goes into shock. And I have so many times people just give up on the plants right away, pretty much. Because what happens is the foliage falls off within a matter of a couple of days and the plants look really sad and you think, okay, that's dead, and you throw it away. I don't think I ever give up on the plant until it's about 6 to 8 months later. Because I have had some things come back from the dead, quite a lot. But also, I always say, I have this example of I planted prairie flame sumac in my garden. Unfortunately, I wasn't the one planting it. My husband was. I wasn't there. And that's what happened. He pulled it out of the pot. The soil went sideways, root disturbance. He put it in the ground. He watered it, but by then it was already done. So what happened is almost immediately the whole shrub defoliated completely. There was not a leaf left on the thing. It was watered right at the planting, but because there were no leaves anymore, there was very little water evaporation. That root ball actually stayed moist for a very long time. So it was planted in August a few years ago, and probably the whole fall, I watered it maybe 4 times. It stayed there the whole end of the season. So it went bare completely until the spring. In the spring, it relieved. It doubled in size. By year 3, it was 11-footer. Because all that energy went, first of all, don't overwater. That's what I did. Had I just kept on watering, thinking, oh, it just, water is the panacea for anything. It's not. When there's no leaves and there's low water evaporation, watering just kills it. So don't water too much. Only water when the plant actually needs it. Like check before you water. And then just be patient. That plant right now is about 13 feet tall. So do not give up on your plants. Planting depth, particularly with shrubs and trees, it is very important that you do not plant it too deep. And when I say too deep, if you plant it level with your ground, because you're fluffing up the soil as you dig in the hole, you probably end up planting it too deep anyways, because the soil will settle and you'll end up with this kind of dip. Another thing is, this is anecdotal, but honestly, just from experience, probably 95% of the trees you get in a nursery are already planted too deep in the container. Take the time to remove all of that excess soil until you get to the root flare. When you remove it, if it's root bound, really make sure you work on those roots. A few years ago, I rescued a Mexican plant that stood in a container in a nursery for far too long. It was completely root bound by the time I got to it. And it took me about 2 hours to dismantle the roots and cut out everything and make sure everything was right. Whatever damage you think you might do at that stage, it is nothing with letting it grow like this and then trying to do it 5 years later when an arborist tells you, well, your tree is dying because it's girdling roots and basically has no chance. You really want to do it then. And with a 5-gallon size or even 10-gallon, it's really fairly easy to do. And also use native soil. Whatever you dig out goes back. Oftentimes people make this mistake of thinking, especially if they have heavy soil like clay, that they will dig this big soil, a big hole, and then they will fill it with this fluffy compost or whatever soil they can get, and somehow that will improve drainage. What they are doing is building a well, and that's not a great thing. You want those roots dealing with the soil they're going to be dealing with right from the get-go. And then I constantly get questions about how people are supposed to fertilize their gardens, native gardens. Don't. Unless you specifically know that somehow your site has a specific deficiency or maybe it was contaminated in the past and you have to do some remediation, just don't. My 18-year-old native garden was not fertilized one time in my life. So everything is doing great. The only thing that I actually add when we do work for clients is the only thing in terms of kind of prepping the soil is just adding a layer of humates, because that's the humates we're using is basically organic matter with beneficial fungi. You want to introduce some life to the soil in case that's lacking. When to plant. So I am in a lot of Facebook gardening groups, and I hear these stories that just kind of make me mad of oh, I bought this plant, but it's July. I will now keep it in a pot and water it until I plant it in October. I'm like, why? So much easier. First of all, then you're devoiding that plant 3 months where it could be establishing. Second of all, it's so much easier to keep it alive in the ground than it is in the pot. And first of all, have you heard of nature? It doesn't just grow in like spring and fall and nothing in between. I plant pretty much all my personal stuff because of time and how intensive spring and fall are. I plant everything, as my shop gardens are a testament to, in the middle of summer or middle of winter, depending on what I feel like. There's always a risk when you're planting. You can think that you're choosing the best season, and that season may end up being the rainiest or the driest or whatever. You just don't know. If you think of last spring, we pretty much went from winter to summer. It was mid 90s in April and dry, and then you went to 105 and stayed there for about 3 months. You may think you're waiting for the right season, but 2 weeks of fair weather in the spring is not enough. When we're doing landscaping, we're obviously planting year round. Our losses in the summer and in the winter are not any really more or less than any other season, especially if you're paying attention to your garden. And of course, a lot depends on of how comfortable you are with your garden, with your gardening skills, and just kind of, can you be hands-on? If you're planning on traveling in the summer, obviously you don't want to be planting right before you leave, because that's probably not the best idea. But the idea that somehow there's this 6 months period in a year between the summer and winter where you are not allowed to plant is just silly. Proper watering, we pretty much covered it. Just check before you water is really the rule of thumb. There is no interval that anyone can give you that will be the right thing to do. There's just not, because the weather will change so dramatically. Probably, honestly, summer in that sense is the easiest because it's consistent. Like you have 2 months of never rains, it's always hot. So like, okay, nothing changes there. Planting during dormancy, the only trick to planting in dormancy, you're planting something that really does not have much need for water. So if we end up having wet, because irrigation, whether you have sprinkler system or whether you're hand watering, you can control that. You can control rain. So really the most challenging part of planting when dormant is, well, if rain happens and it's already wet and you have heavy soil and then just stays wet for about 3 weeks and then it rains again and then you end up losing something. But like I said, there's risk with any type of season whenever you're planting. Okay, that's it. So any questions? Yes.
So I don't have my policy.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And the lights.
On the balcony? Yes. So you want to go.
For the people on.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I forgot. So if you live in an apartment and you don't have an outdoor space, does that mean that you cannot have native plants? It doesn't. You can plant in pots. The bigger the pot, the more forgiving it is, only because it doesn't dry out as quickly. But then plant choice, it's not just a matter of what kind of sun exposure you have. It's a matter of, like, for pots, plants that develop deep taproot are not the best. They will go very quickly like this, block the drainage hole, and that will be it, right? You want something that has a fibrous root system and will kind of be content in the pot for a few years. I once grew a Japan holly in a large, like 3-foot pot, and for 6 years it was happy as can be. So you can absolutely have it. Yes. That's blue sage, Salvia azurea. One of my favorites. And we have it interspersed with purple threon, and it's like the perfect combo. I love it. Because the purple threon is not as tall as the blue sage. They really go. So you see the blue, but then you don't look at the bare stalks. You have it all covered up by the grass. It's looking really cool.
Could you repeat that?
This plant?
Yeah.
Salvia azurea, blue sage. Yeah.
What is it that you planted with?
Purple threon. It's a grass. Purple threon. Aristida purpurea. Yes?
So if we have So we have to bring some dirt in for a bed, and stuff. What kind of dirt should we bring?
Straight compost is all I do. Straight compost with humates mixed in. That's it. I never use anything else.
So
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. If you have to bring in, and sometimes you have to bring in your soil. If you're starting with a bed, or if you're buying a property and you have to dig out a bunch because you had some really undesirable species growing, and then there was the only way to get rid of them. What do you do if you cannot use your native soil? If you have raised beds, for instance, the only thing I ever use, both for pots and for any kind of landscape job, and I've been doing that professionally for 18 years, compost, straight compost with some humates mixed in, and that's it.
where do you get your compost?
There are many places. There's Living Air, the Silver Creek. Honestly, none of these places are great, right? Compost on a commercial scale is processed really quickly. It gets basically very, very hot, and then they sell it. And so what that means also that it becomes pretty kind of barren, honestly. There's not a lot of life in it. So that's why we add the beneficial fungi and the humate to introduce life to the compost. But texture of it is extremely permeable. It's very fluffy. So you really have to, like when you're building your bed, build by an inch or two higher than what you think, because the first few rains and it will all go down. Yes.
Kind of following up with that, with the, if you're, were you saying that like if you're using, instead of potting soil, compost?
I never use potting soil. We've done plenty of
Right.
pots for containers. Yeah.
What's the ratio? You said it's a little bit, of humus.
Look, the known problem with humates is it's basically organic matter and some beneficial fungi. You're not going to burn anything. I mean, honestly, you could just like, oh, I put too much by accident. Not a big deal. Just mix it up and forget about it. Mostly.
It's like starting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So where's your humus?
So humates, we carry Microlife brand because over the years, I've tried so many. We started 18 years ago as landscape design installation, but we were organic from the get-go. So I went through years of trials of different organic products, and they were really frustrating. There was a lot of inconsistency. You'll have a batch of this, a batch of that, everything will be different. It was really kind of not up to par. Microlife to me is the first brand that, first of all, is not based on biosolids, because I was really trying to avoid that. And second of all, it's really, really consistent as a product. And we've used it for 10 years now, and I've been very happy with it. Microlife. And we sell it on EcoBlossom, but you can buy it at other places too. Microlife. Life. It's a really good brand. They have a bunch of fertilizers and other things, but honestly, humates is mostly what we use. Yes.
Do you have suggestions on
Growing from seed. Well, okay, but suggestion on what? But that's a very broad question.
So at least establishment, bed preparation, contact with seed.
I do zero. So my idea with seed grow. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. So how do you prep for seeds? I am a very lazy gardener when it comes to seeds. My idea of planting seeds is like this, and it's growing. And I've had pretty good success with it. I'm not saying it's 100%, but with seeds, you will never have 100%. I started growing a few years ago just because there were so many species I couldn't get. I got frustrated, so I started growing. And it's the same thing. I get containers, I fill it with compost with a little bit of humates, put the seeds, dependent on the depth. The smaller the seed, some seeds really are so tiny and they need the sunlight to germinate. So you want those just on top and basically just good contact to the soil. The bigger the seed, you want it deeper in the soil. But honestly, there's not that much to it. So I know like milkweeds have this reputation of being very, very difficult to germinate. And I'm not saying I am no guru when it comes to milkweeds, but I've also threw some seeds of Asclepias tuberosa this year on a tray, and with zero any kind of prep, and everything sprouted. So I'm like, okay. This year, yeah. So like I said, the things we grew if you grow it in your garden bags, so American basket flower, the purple trio, and a bunch of other things, literally good contact with soil, and that's that. And by the way, I usually do it kind of end of August, early September, but honestly, you can throw the seed anytime. You will germinate when the conditions are right. Easy. The only frustrating things that you will have in the garden with seeds is the germination rate can be very inconsistent, and sometimes you have a whole seed packet and nothing germinates. And that's just how it is with seed. But another thing is that seeds tend to really move. Like you have rain, it can be displaced, and then you end up with like this whole clump of everything in one spot, and it's really unpredictable. That happened to us because we're on a slope, and so when we have those heavy rains in the spring, I've learned that all of my seeds of my purple tree basically end up in one spot. So and you don't realize it until everything sprouts, and it is what it is by the time. So but otherwise it's fun, it's easy, and it's not expensive.
No, they're just
So you were mail order?
No. You order on our website and then you come and pick up. We do delivery, but very, very narrow area, only in parts of Fort Worth. I encourage doing pickup because when you come to pickup, you can buy more if you want to. You can just wander, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is you don't have to buy anything. You can still look around. And that's where the whole gardens come into play, because people get the visual of what a plant. You have no idea how many people told me, I had no idea Gora got that big. So unless you see it, looking at pictures, oftentimes you don't have scale of things. You have this up close of a bloom, and that's pretty and everything, but you don't have an idea of what a plant actually will be. So that's why we have the garden, so you can kind of look around and see what things are, but also so that I have the one-on-one in case you have questions. So everything is by appointment only. You schedule a time, and so we always have time to chat if that's what you want.